I don't. Did you? I don't know. Like, there. She's out there. You're the Florida version of Sex in the City, JD.
That's when I was smoking my cigar.
Don't be an asshole today.
Something. Hi, Joe.
Hello, nice to meet you.
So nice to meet you.
It's an ungodly hour in Australia, but not for me. I'm the vampire over here.
Me
So,
too.
Gemma, yeah,
uh,
yeah, she is, yeah.
Totally
I'm the same way.
that.
I get more done in the evenings than I'll ever get during the day.
Absolutely.
You know,
yeah.
yeah. So
Yeah.
Gem's parents are here from, well, her mom and her mom's boyfriend are here from Australia, and she took them up to the Lake District this week.
Oh, lovely.
She said she would have definitely popped over my shoulder to say hello.
Oh, no, but Lake District, that's a great choice. So
I know. They're having such
probably
good time.
great weather for it too. I mean, it's so hot over there.
It's actually like just perfect, not too hot.
Oh, yeah, right.
It's not like too hot that you can't do walking tours and all that kind of stuff. So they're loving it. They're having a really good
I mean,
time.
you're from Florida, so it's all just whatever for you, right?
Yeah, I'm a little bit of a stickler about the heat. I don't like it because
Sure.
even though like Jay and I are from Florida, we're so accustomed to everything being air conditioned, you know?
Right.
Yeah, true.
Right.
True.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Is
and
the Lake-
Queensland's so similar in many ways. It's so similar.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, big time. You
Is the Lake District like the countryside there? Is that
yeah, it's more dense, foresty, historic, you know, that kind of thing where the Bronte sisters did their writing, and you know, it's there's a lot of tradition up there, like
oh
yeah. So it's but I do think that Gemma's mother was born up that way, so she is familiar with a lot of the places that they're going.
oh
Okay.
that's interesting.
Like a reconnect for her. So it's very, very sweet that Gem took the week off to do that. It's a lot of driving, you know, it's pretty far. It's pretty far from
beautiful drive though for
Yeah.
parts of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's really it's great. So so Joe, we talked yesterday about your you are a composer, you are a music arranger, you are constantly busy.
Yeah.
I'm amazed at some of the projects you've got going on. Did you hear anything about the were you up for an award?
I was, and it was on Tuesday was the ceremony, and we didn't win. Wasn't our
Oh,
night. Great to be nominated, but what the news I do have, which it's unofficial, but it's looking extremely likely that the show will be at the Sydney Opera House. More likely than ever before.
Wow.
wow.
So yeah. So we've had an Adelaide Festival run, that was the premiere, and then next year, cross fingers and toes and touch all the woods and what have you, we will have it at the Sydney Opera House next year. Yeah.
And
Wow.
we were talking about the death of Dr. Duncan.
That's right. Watershed is the sort of quick name, but yeah, but the death of Dr. Duncan is, and there's actually now a book by the historian as well called The Death of Dr. Duncan, which was connected very much to the show because he was our historical consultant and very much a big part of the show. In fact, he even appears in the show because it's just part of his world in a sense. Not himself, he represented it.
Yeah.
You know, I've taught solo, and actually in the production we have a picture of him as well. But we actually just call him historian, so it's not like we name him in the show. But you know, it's just that's to sort of jump ahead in the sense that's an example of you know, the repercussions of a moment, the same way I'm sure it was with Matthew Shepard in the US. You know, such a horrific event, and then the court cases, the injunctions, and then the political machinations and all that stuff. So yeah.
So in a way, the topic is pretty timely with what is happening with the LGBT community now.
So much.
Yeah.
And even specifically in Australia, I mean, I mean, to go broad, I mean, I get the impression on Twitter, at least, I'm going to call it Twitter, and I'm never going to call it X, by the way.
I know,
But
so pornographic.
but that
Okay.
trans issues are, we're going through that in a horrific way now. I get the impression it's really ramped up in the UK. There's a touch of it here, but it has an American flavor to it in a sense, sort of
Totally.
that's right. But to go to even just the issue, we had a murder of, funnily enough, an American man in Sydney in the 80s, I believe, that has just finally had been brought to justice. So the murderer has been finally been put in jail, basically. And that's taken decades. That's Scott Johnson, who was a mathematician and worked over here.
Okay.
Yeah. And also they're actually doing an inquiry into murders of gay men in particular. But I hope that they're really thinking, hang on a sec, this is a community. There will be so many instances of trans abuse and what have you, and all the LGBTQ community are affected. So, but there are a plethora of particular violence against gay men, murders, unsolved murders, and what have you. So, so and the fact that it's going to be done in Sydney, fingers crossed and everything.
Yeah.
It's funny how that was a moment for Adelaide, but it was the first jurisdiction in Australia, well, I think in English-speaking world, to eventually decriminalize homosexual acts between men, and then that sort of had repercussions and flowed through. But in Sydney, there's this injunction. Well, sorry, there's a investigation now, an inquiry into historical corruption in the police and unsolved murders and hate crimes, bashings against gay men in particular.
It seems like it's taken so long for the smallest steps, like even to get something deemed a hate crime now.
Yeah.
It amazes me that it has to tick all the boxes of certain criteria. You know what I mean? Like it's obvious to everyone that it is, and yet in order for it to be deemed a hate crime, so that the punishment is fitting,
Right.
It just seems to me that it takes so long to move an inch, where anything is concerned like this. And I guess like maybe about 2 months ago, Jem and I went with a friend of ours to Two Brewers, which is a gay bar in Clapham Junction. And we went for it was like a softball party. Like all the teams were coming to kick off their season and whatnot, and we had a really good time. And there was a drag show, and it was in the drag show was in the front, and the party was in a back room, private room or whatever. But then at a certain point, like the doors opened up and everybody just kind of merged, and it was like, it was the first time I had been in a queer club in a really long time, as opposed to just going down to like Brighton, where the whole area is kind of queer, but in a queer club that was, right there in Clapham Junction. And we had a really good time. And like 2 days ago, I'm scrolling my social media and I see a post that 2 men were stabbed outside of Two Brewers in Clapham.
I saw that.
And I'm like, oh my God, we were just there.
Oh, geez.
When something hits like that close,
Yeah.
it's just like it takes your breath away, because I don't know, and for me, like, I don't want to be numb to it. Like I want it to have that effect on me, so that we can be more vigilant, we can be more aware, and your situational awareness is on high, when you go out and whatnot. But I just felt like we'd be so much further along, I don't know.
Sure. It's funny. I feel like when we have sort of bigger moments of change, like various nations. I mean, I feel like I was in the USA when marriage equality was achieved there, nationwide, obviously, and that felt wonderful. And then before you know it, Pulse nightclub happens, and then you drag, and then Ireland has it, and then Australia finally has marriage equality, and then just the trans hate comes out, and you're just like, oh,
Right.
yeah,
Was that
constant.
was that on your mind when you were piecing together the Dr. Duncan story?
Sure. I
Yeah.
mean, in many ways, I had the beautiful kind of opportunity to work with a whole group. So I mentioned the historian a moment ago. That's Tim Reeves, and he's spent his life really dedicated. I mean, he's actually got a book in architecture as well. So he has it's in design, decor. Anyway, that's so. But he's dedicated a lot of his life to this man and this moment. That night that he was murdered, which is just full of surrounded with all sorts of contradictions and different accounts, and there were several injunctions and several court cases and what have you, and it was all kind of about police corruption and about conflicting accounts because of course it was criminal to out yourself as gay, so there was all sorts of problems, but which has always been a problem. So, but in terms of piecing it together in that way, we had Tim Reeves, of course. We had Neil Armfield, and this was his baby, really. He was the one who phoned me and said, have you heard about the death of have you heard about Dr. George Duncan, although he was more affectionately known as Ian Duncan? That's his second name. So it's actually Ian Duncan. Have you heard about the murder of him and what it led to? And I said, no. And so I went on this great pilgrimage and realized I was a bit of an ignoramus, really, to Australian queer history, that this was such a watershed moment, and that's why we called it Watershed.
Right.
And then we had two librettists. So Christos Chalkis and Alana Valentine worked together on this. You may know Christos in particular for his work. He's got a book, and it's actually been turned into a TV series that was even an American version called The Slap. I don't know if you've heard of that. It was a TV series a while back. I think the American version only lasted one season. There's always that sense that, does something translate to a different, to a sort of
it doesn't translate.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Like The Office worked, but Kath and Kim didn't, it's that kind of thing. But yeah, so The Slap is it's very much one of his main works. But he's also got, he's a very well-known author over here. He also wrote a book called Head On, which was turned into a film. And then Alana Valentine too. So, an entire queer team brought together to be the creatives. And then I was basically there as Mr. Music. And and we had discussions about whether it would be an opera or whether it would be more of an oratorio. And by that, I mean like Handel's Messiah, that kind of thing.
Right.
Rather than a sort of straight staged play, there's nothing straight about it at all. Sorry, I shouldn't use the word straight in this context. But it does, in terms of the unfolding or the sort of realism of it, do you just present the characters as they are? Or what an oratorio does, which is sort of a much older tradition, quite a Christian tradition, sorry, but then of course it's been redone and revamped in many ways. And we can make it our own. But what it becomes in that sense is a little bit more like Greek tragedy. So that if an oratorio is more about the voices and the choir and the soloists, not so much about, a character being played by a voice literally and being presented as real, as sort of, stylized realism.
Right.
It becomes more abstract in a sense, and that often what happens is the choir become like society and they play different roles. So they'll sing something, but they may be different people or different groups of people at different times. But then you'll have a soloist who represent one person, but we would have them change. So the guy, for example, who played Duncan at first, then later became Don Dunstan, lots of D's obviously in the names, who was the premier in South Australia, who was really, there were lots of political machinations, but it was really under him as the premier, the leader of the government in South Australia, to finally bring on in 1985 eventually the decriminalization of homosexuality of homosexual acts between men, I should say, but and an equal age of consent, interestingly too, which was not achieved anywhere else. And I well, at the time anyway. And I believe, I mean, I'm not an expert, but I've picked a lot of this up as I went and did what I do. But I believe South Australia was, because of what happened, the first English-speaking jurisdiction in the world to decriminalize homosexuality. I think the UK had started, but not fully, and then maybe it happened later. So it's very interesting that this happened, and it all happens, in the aftermath of in the time of Vietnam, that kind of culture, police corruption. In Australia, it was a change of government, in particular to Gough Whitlam, who was a major reformist prime minister at the time. He really dragged us out of the 50s and into the 70s, that kind of thing. Right. So it's the continuation of that in many ways. So collaboration was incredible, and there was just a lot to learn, but I sort of was the emotion behind the sort of facts that I learned, and then directed, of course, by Neil Armfield, and then, of course, the literary genius of Alana and Christos. Yeah.
I was going to ask you that as a composer and a musician, like when you're signed on to do a project like that, how do you, where do you go to decide how you want the music, what style? And that's interesting, that you say that, because it is the emotion. It brings the music part brings the emotion to the whole project. So that's got to be. Is that solely left up to you as the composer as to what style of music you would be using?
I think it is, although I think overall in this case, it's kind of like, we've chosen your voice. We've heard what you do, the language that you create. And I do write a lot for choir, but I also write for orchestra as well and stuff like that. But also I think maybe because I do film as well. But I think comparing it with film is probably the best way to describe it. Writing an opera or an oratorio, I mean, let's put them in the same category in a way, as like a staged thing that isn't necessarily music theater, but they can connect. I think there's moments of music theater in my show as well. But writing in that style, or having that gig, is like doing a movie backwards. It's so it's as though I'm writing the movie and they're filming it to I'm writing the script kind of in collaboration. Yeah. Wow. I mean, there's different exceptions, because when Spielberg hires John Williams, he's definitely hiring John Williams' sound. So there's a similarity that way, but he does the film, and then John Williams fits it to that. And often John Williams will talk about how, you write a phrase, but then you might have to save the sort of second part of the phrase for another piece later, or maybe the credits or something like that, because the scene only goes for so long and it has to change or what have you. So you can't just, continue on forever. You need to give space to the dialogue and to the story and what have you. Whereas in writing a piece like this, in particular, you can let that unfold and let the music unfold, and particularly with oratorio too, because it is more abstract. There's no sense that a scene and it takes this long, then we have a flashback or we flash forward and what have you. We can just kind of tackle ideas. There is a chronological sense to it to a degree, but we can be a lot more abstract about what we're portraying here, and we can have tableaus and have moments of reflection. That's kind of the best way I think to describe it. And in the end, I think my style was what they wanted from kind of casting me in a way for the show. But
that's really cool. Like so I was looking at some of the other projects and stuff that you've done, and it's so vastly different.
Right.
Like I saw the Bluey in the credits, and then I saw Pitch Perfect 3. Baywatch.
Oh, that's right. And that was just television like an hour ago here.
What was
funny? Pitch Perfect 3. It's funny that you had mentioned it. It was just on TV. And I thought, oh, good, I'm getting paid.
But they're so different. you know,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
your catalog feels eclectic and broad. So I'm wondering, when you get called up for a project, you know, especially something that's heavy, like this, you know, Watershed, versus what you do with Bluey and Pitch Perfect, does your whole mindset going in feel different?
Well, part of that is taken care of for me, because I would describe Bluey, Pitch Perfect, and Watershed. They're not only completely different in terms of the style and what have you, but I have completely different roles on them. So
Okay.
in Pitch Perfect, I am literally no one. In fact, I'm not even in the credits, to be honest with you. Sorry to burst the bubble. My company is in the credits. So that was just a gig. That
Okay.
was a great sort of like, oh, we need someone who basically it was my job to help with the orchestration and print out the music, make sure it's all in order, make sure there's no wrong notes,
Okay.
go to the recording session, put it on the music stands, and sit there and be ready to print some more music if something goes wrong, basically.
Wow.
That was
Like a
like
project manager, like a
yeah,
music project manager.
totally. Well, I mean, I worked for this company called Steve and Giuliani Music. Steve was the boss, and I worked for him. I mean, that, you know, working in Hollywood is like, you know, there are people who are major, but they are helped to be major by having a lot of people help them, and I'm one of many, you know, in that case.
Right,
For
right.
example,
Oh,
working
definitely.
for a company who works for a composer, who works for a director, it's that kind of thing. Bluey is a little bit of like the next tier up in terms of like, you know, creative involvement, having a credit and what have you. In that, that's really my good friend Joff's gig. Joff Bush is the composer of Bluey. He wrote the famous theme. It's his gig. I've done 20 episodes out of 154. Every episode feels like a feature film. It's a lot of work. In fact, I feel like I did more work on 2 episodes maybe of Bluey than I did on Watershed in some ways. It's
Wow.
not true. It's
Yeah.
just a lot, like a lot of people involved in that show.
Yeah.
And it's but uh yeah, but he basically subcontracts me as someone, oh, this would be great for Joe. And there's about 15-ish composers in total. I think I've probably done apart from Joff, and I'd probably be on par with 1 or 2 other composers as well. And I live down the road from his studio, and I'm always in
Oh,
there.
how
We're working
convenient.
on,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So that's like
I
a
was
team. We're
excited.
kind of like a collaborative team on different shows for that. And
It's,
then
I was
Watershed is for me,
yeah.
basically.
Yeah,
when I
that
saw that
feels
you did the music for Bluey, I was like, oh, I have to let my nephews love Bluey. And I'm like, I told Denise, oh, he does, and the Wiggles. He did a Wiggles project too. Those are the two that I knew. And I thought that was like so cool that you have such a diverse catalog of, you know, going from Bluey and the Wiggles to the
Yeah.
dark, the deeper stuff that you've
yeah.
done.
And not even like to mention your involvement with choir, you know,
Yeah.
and opera. And
Mhm.
like I was looking at some of the different pieces that were on your website. Do you do you prefer like that? Because it seems so much bigger, you know, it just feels bigger, and it's, you know, climatic and swells, and you know, it's definitely, and it feels more live in the moment. So
Mm.
is choir like something that you just kind of keep in your back pocket, or for
Well, choir is where I started, I think. My first, you know, major achievement, I guess, was winning a competition with a famous choir called Chanticleer who are based in San Francisco. I was only 21, and then I just became a big choir nerd. There was a very strong choral program at UQ where I met Jem, for example.
yes, I know
And
she's very
I
into
was Gemma's theory teacher too, I think, back in the day.
it. Yes.
Five
So
degrees, 6 degrees.
yeah, I was just thinking how there's so much they do, but choir I think it'll always be a major part, and even to the point where if Joff might find an episode of Bluey and go, oh, it's got choir or it needs choir, like let's get Twist in to, you know, get some great vocal parts and vocal arrangements and that kind of thing. I mean, in some ways it's like, it's funny that I'm sort of doing all different things. I know I have a cool career, but maybe at some point it might settle into one thing, which is, I don't mind if it doesn't, but just thinking about someone like Harry Gregson Williams, I'm pretty sure it was either Rupert or Harry, one of the Gregson Williams. They were composers based in London, and they met a fellow called Hans Zimmer, who happened to be working on a film called The Lion King, and they needed vocal arrangements. They didn't need vocal arrangements for the African music that was obviously included in it. They needed someone to arrange for voice for the choral parts that would be more like background. I think this is true. This is sort of something I've heard via osmosis, so it might not be accurate completely, but I'm sure that was the beginning. So obviously that was like a gig they had to do, but it wasn't like the composing gig. It was a helping out gig. And then they moved to LA. They got really chummy with Hans. Hans like gave them tens of thousands of dollars to set up a studio, and now they're fully fledged A-list Hollywood composers. So, you know, even though that didn't happen for me when I lived over there so much, I'm very grateful for the things I worked on. And but it just goes to show that a composer is not just, well, first of all, it's not a dead white man.
Yeah.
You know, it's you know, black women and anyone, for example,
Right,
you know, and
right.
we need to acknowledge that. But second of all, some composers do a sort of one or two things, and others do a lot more. And that just depends on the composer. Philip Glass, for example, is, even though he does film scores as well, although he's sort of dragged into it slowly, he does Philip Glass, and that's kind of the most thing. Whereas, I mean, if you look at actually John Williams's, just to go back to good old Johnny, his sort of trajectory and his everything he's done, from being a army band arranger to a fully fledged jazz pianist with a very successful jazz band, then to writing all kinds of film scores. He calls himself a chameleon in that way. And I think that's great. And I loved, and he'll do arrangements. He's done commercials. He played piano for many years in studios, you know. So I think that if you love the idea of telling a story through music, and that's basically what I do, whether it's like writing a choral piece, doing an arrangement of a pop song with a famous artist, like all the Wiggles, you know, it's all just storytelling. It might be a little contrived sometimes, but you're still in some way telling a story through music, like using the spectrum of voices, sometimes matched with words, or orchestra and the colors of orchestra and instruments and chords and harmonies matched with picture to tell story. That's really overall the guts of what you're doing. And whether it's an arranging gig with the Wiggles, or animated show like Bluey, or a tragic historical event with political and social, you know, machinations like Watershed, then, you know, that's what you're doing. You're telling a story with music. Yeah.
It's true.
Yeah.
I think,
And the emotion it brings.
and you know, we're kind of like at a time, like if you think about like in the 80s, soundtracks were making their way into mainstream, you know, film soundtracks were really making their way from, well, I mean, going back like Saturday Night Fever, you know, was like, right? But, you know, the ones that have like more of a like musical, you know, without like a pop song or a song that you're going to hear on the radio, like The Godfather, you know, I think like, you know, people went back and looked at those scores, you know, and because of how popular soundtracks were getting, it made you appreciate, you know, the composition in film things. Like I remember, for me, after I saw Steel Magnolias in the theater, you know, and then I would, you know, see a commercial or something for it on TV, and those melodies or those notes would, you know, you could connect with them again. I went out and bought like the soundtrack to Steel Magnolias, you know, just like, oh my God, like there's no words, it's all instrumental, you know, but it just like made you
Yeah.
even more with a film. And I think that that it seems like finally, composers are getting more work, more notoriety,
Mhm.
more and more. Except, there's those big few, like you mentioned, Hans Zimmer and John Williams, and those, we hear and we know because they win Oscars so often. You
So,
know what I
yeah,
mean?
that's right.
But to know a little bit more about like behind the scenes what it's like, I love watching like a documentary and stuff
Mhm.
about it where you see the picture on this huge screen and they're all in like a symphony hall and they're watching it with absolutely no sound, and then you're watching them, the conductor, with an orchestra putting that sound together, and
Yeah.
it's a just an underappreciated talent,
Absolutely. Yeah.
for doing that. Like it's very,
Totally.
yeah, it's really
It's a rich
interesting.
tradition. I mean, it's why I moved to Los Angeles. Well, I started in New York and then I moved to LA, but it's why I was so keen to get over there. I mean, I applied for a scholarship 8 times at least. It took me a whole decade to finally get the scholarship to go to the USA.
Wow.
And I got a PhD in that time randomly. Just I get 10 years, I'll do a PhD anyway. Yeah, and I finally got the scholarship, and I'd learned things, and I'd studied over here as well. Obviously, composition PhD, but I also did a film music course, and then I went and did another master's after my PhD. Really weird doing a master's after your PhD at NYU. So I finally got this scholarship. Then I moved to LA, and I lived there for a good 6 years and worked in the industry on, we mentioned Pitch Perfect 3 was one example. I did work on The Force Awakens, for example, Star Wars. That was one of my first, right at the very end of it. Did almost nothing on it, but
Baywatch. Lest we forget
well,
Baywatch.
yeah, the movie. Although I kind of wish I was around in the night. Well, it's a good and a bad thing. This is something about the nostalgia of how innocent the old Baywatch show was,
Yeah.
in some
Right,
ways.
right. Yep. Yeah. It's
But
pretty cool though. It's
I
almost,
totally.
Jay, as a singer-songwriter, your music and lyrics and composition of a song is like usually like deeply personal, whereas
Right.
Joe, you sometimes have to leave the personal aside for the
right.
project that you're working on to put the music to um you know to match what's going on, in the project. Like it's very similar but so different in the way that you have to approach it.
The closest I could think of, like that I could relate to that, is I've had two people ask me to write songs for. One was for a wedding, was for their own personal wedding song, and one was my friend wanted a song to from her to her mom and dad to thank them for how they supported her through her life, as a gift to them for their anniversary. So I would sit down and say, well, tell me your story, like particularly for the wedding song, like how did you meet and what do you want to say? And so that's the closest I could really relate to that. But I could see where that's completely very, very different when it's almost like doing it backwards, like Joe said, like first you're almost like the movie
Hmm.
first. But what you said before, Denise, was interesting when there's a composer like a certain style of music brings you right back to the era or the
Mhm.
decade or other movies in that realm and that feeling. Because I just watched an old Barbara Streisand movie, The Mirror Has Two Faces,
Oh
and
yeah.
I think Marvin Hamlish did the music for that, and I think he was really good friends with her. And I like just watching the movie and hearing the music in the background brought on a feeling of like nostalgia, like just brought me right back to like I think it was the early 90s that movie was from.
Mhm.
So I totally get what you mean, because at the end of the movie I'm like, oh, Marvin Hamlish did that score. So most of it, a lot of it was popular music that they were just playing like when they were dancing in the nightclub and stuff. It was like some standards. But yeah, I get totally understand what you mean by that. It could totally
Yeah.
feeling, even if it's just the background music,
Right.
like it's still
Right.
magnetic.
Yeah. It's just crazy. There's been a few instrumental soundtracks, that really resonated with me. And one of them was an old Julia Roberts movie. I can't even remember the name of it, with Campbell Scott, and he was dying of cancer, and she was like this haphazard chick looking for a job and got hired to take care of him or whatever.
Oh yeah, Dying Young.
Dying young, yes.
Yeah.
That was another soundtrack I went out and bought because the instrumental was so beautiful, and I didn't have an appreciation for things like that before movies. Like, I can't say that, I listened to classical music or orchestral music, before that, but because something, with the movie and hearing it made me appreciate it more, go out, buy it, and then I became like, wow, like I dig this. I had it in my car. I bought the CD. It was crazy.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
adds so much to the emotion of the scenes. Like Joe, like I can't even imagine, Joe, like how you would begin to like compose, like especially the orchestral type of music. Like I just watched, I've been on an older movie kick, like when I say older, it's the 90s, which is kind of scary to think the
Yeah,
90s are older movies. The
exactly.
Perfect Storm with
Oh, great.
the music in that
I think it's
movie.
James Horner. Is it James Horner? I think.
Amazing. Like it just that brought everything to life. I mean, the whole thing with when they were at the sea, when you see the ship at sea, it's just like
Yeah.
when you write for something like that, like how do you even begin to think about how big you want that to be?
It's tough. And it's even more tough when you go from thing to thing, like we've sort
Yeah,
of talked about being eclectic.
right.
But one trick which has risks but can help is to do what's called temping or a temp score, for example. In fact, a temp score can actually be a score that's been put to a film by someone else completely, just for the editor. Just go, oh, I need something here, and they get anything, something from old scores, often just or even these days library music, which a lot of reality TVs, and I've actually got some music out there. You just write a mood, a vamp, a style that's just really easy to edit, and you just chuck it out there. But so often just putting something up against it, anything. And actually, I mean, often you're working with computers these days. It's so much easier, although it has its problems too. But you can get a pretty decent sounding an actual recording of a flute in your keyboard. You just chuck it up, and it'll always not be as good as a real thing, but at least it's a recording of each note in certain ways and sometimes phrases, and you can use that. So you just you put it there on just a scale, a chord, and you go, what is this making you feel? Now, even just to be technical about it, I think it even just goes back to, but also not too technical. We think about major and minor chords, and when we're very young, maybe our teachers tell us, or we work it out for ourselves. What is a major chord? What is a minor chord? Well, one makes you feel happy and one makes you feel sad. However, the beauty of music is that context really comes into it too, because you can write a really sad song in a major key. And I always think some of the really fun stuff is when you start, mixing and blending, or you can, or even a simple thing like, I mean, this goes to opera and this goes to, and even like the music in the early 20th century. So, obviously the Hollywood tradition was like the European orchestra thing that then went into America and jazz, and it's just all very broad and what have you. But, it does still grow. Traditions still grow out of what was created in classical and romantic periods, operatic music with certain sounds, and what instruments signify. John Williams chose obviously the lowest note in the double bass for a shark, for various reasons. But if you've got birds, you'll use high-pitched instruments to sound like birds. But even something like a tradition where just for example, the early 20th century ballets of Stravinsky and people like that, they would use the folk tunes of the day or the folk tunes that people knew. They were often just all the white notes or all just simple major scales, sometimes minor scales. But if they put more of the chromatic notes in, or explored relationships between chords that weren't just like 1, 5, 4, or weren't just sort of diatonic, weren't just sort of in the major scale, started borrowing from other things, the more it became things that were supernatural or things that were magical and otherworldly. I mean, actually, it's funny going back and looking at, Bach is actually, I mean, it's not really that old, but people sort of rediscovered Bach even a couple hundred years ago. And it's funny how there was even a discussion about how when he would write chromatic, going through all the black and white notes on the keyboard, and that would signify one thing and mean like a kind of tension. And then when he went back to just sort of major, minor scales and modes, that would represent something else emotionally. You look at the words in his passions and his cantatas and what have you, often very, very, well, of course they're Christian, but how they tell the story and they relate to different characters, it's all the same thing, but just in different styles. So that's like my rambling of how I think it works. But I think as a kid, I was just captivated with this background music, or even just the way a song helped a montage sequence, or whatever.
Right.
It's just, it's a fascination of how visuals and story and music relate. There's no rules, but there are conventions and cliches in a good way, I mean, that we've created over hundreds of years.
Yeah.
I don't even think people realize like how subliminal, the effect it has on them. Like I can't try on clothes without wanting to play Pretty Woman, right? And we all saw the movie, and it just dum 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 dum. It's like it makes you just want to go put on something and come out and show it. Like it has such an effect on us that we don't even really know, and it's.
And I think it exists in the world of TikTok still. I mean, the tracks that play when you're scrolling through endlessly, and there's, they all still have a vibe and a feel, and some of them are humorous and some of them are sexy and so and sexy might mean more bluesy for whatever reason. I mean, that's just like we just apply that tradition, and yet the blues scale can also come from spirituals, which are so the opposite of being sexy, so
right.
It's funny how there's connections, but the context, there's something about a rhythm or a chord or whatever that relates to things. I think it's just a mix of the world around us that exist, like things that are objective, and then things that are subjective that are usually more cultural, and they're just an interplay of that, basically.
It's so true. I feel like the older I get, the more expansive, your mind becomes, whereas I'm sure at some point it'll narrow and snap right shut, like in my 70s, but right now is a moment. And like I for the longest time, I would come downstairs on Sunday mornings and Gemma would have like the classical music playing while she was reading a book or having a cup of tea or whatever.
Nice.
And I would never in my lifetime before, like that would never occur to me to check that genre out. You know what I mean? But like I would pour a cup of coffee and I'd sit next to her on the couch and I would just sit there and I'd be like, this is nice. This is
right. It's like
all of a sudden, but I just feel like we're just at this point where people are starting to appreciate, music more. And I do think that weirdly, it's because more people are interested in technology, and they might not have to have like this extensive music background and stuff, and they're messing around with like GarageBand and different sounds in there, like they're able to do like their own little thing with it and feel super proud of it. You know what I mean? But I do think that we're at where music and technology like you were saying, computers, now are making things a little bit easier, and they do have their downside, I'm sure, but not to mention the apps and all that other stuff, and realizing that, like, to make a TikTok video, it's so simple to put music to it. And
Yeah.
now it's made, something that was just a dumb video or whatever, even better, and
Right.
it's just, it just amazes me how everything intersects at some point, like it's really crazy to think that, there's one way of doing things where you can sit with some lined, music paper and compose that way. And there's another way to do it, by sound and technology. Like we've just come so far, and it's it must be a little bit daunting, like to know, like to think about what the future holds.
Well, I mean, I think the future is AI, and dare I drop that into, and
Yeah.
that's a scary thing. However, I have faith in the sense that, in at least in terms of really good storytelling, scoring a picture in particular, the art of it, unless hopefully I'm not proven wrong. I don't think anyone's, I mean, people have, obviously AI has now written songs. I think they've all been rubbish. I've still haven't seen, like, some have been like, wow, that's freakishly, like, it's still freaky that that's the computer. Like, we're all a bit amazed by that wow, we didn't realize it'd be that good. But I don't worry so much about them writing good songs. I mean, I'm terrible at lyrics. That's why I work with lyricists. It's interesting. So JD, I always, I take my hat to have to people like you who create a story from the beginning. I'm more of a springboard person, but I don't think AI is going to. I think AI is worrying with lyrics actually more than music itself. I mean, the music, it might be able to create a. There are certain genres that I think it can easily create something that is probably generic, and that's subjective, I know, but it just kind of makes sense that it picks up on these trends that are so clear in what we do and have become generic, that the computer can do that. Okay, that's fine. But when you think about how someone very carefully scores Star Wars, for example, I mean, I reckon AI could probably score a scene from Law and Order, possibly.
Right. Right.
Because usually, and actually Mike Post is brilliant and I love what he does, it wouldn't do it with the same finesse. It would miss some deep emotional elements, but
right.
Often it is just a tone and then another tone very slowly, and then it moves and it becomes more and more dissonant and cycle, and just intervals that are not sort of, they're well, basically dissonant, and that usually sounds more freaky and scary and psychological. So I reckon it could possibly do some of that, but for it to do the complex interweaving of Princess Leia's theme with Ben Kenobi's theme that then becomes the Force theme in a different way, and like the same theme is now used in a whole new orchestration, like that would be, if it can do that, then God help us all. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree with you there. Like, I feel like AI is never going to be able to caption human emotion, that is so needed in stuff like that. A commercial jingle, yeah, probably no problem.
Right.
You know what I mean? Or those little segues between scenes and sitcoms, like, yeah, no biggie. But to capture the human emotion that you need in a massive project that is going to going to affect people, and that you want to affect people. I think it's never going to be able to do that, and I just don't see that happening. I mean, like you said, God willing, God willing, it can't.
That's it. I also don't think you can do a really good commercial jingle. I mean, if it does, it'll be interesting. But I actually think that humans have written the best commercial jingles simply because we can write hooks and hits. And I haven't heard AI do a hit like, Brill Cream, the oldest jingle out there. Why is it good? I don't know, but it's just something catchy about it. It's an earworm that sticks in your head. I think it required a human to know what sticks in your head.
Right. That's true. I and also, like, going back to what we were talking before about like different eras. First of all, I think I was wrong about Marvin Hamlish doing. I just looked it up. The Mirror Has Two Faces. I think it was a different Barbara Streisand movie, but it definitely was a Barbara Streisand movie. I was listening the other day to On Hold music from AT&T or something, Home Depot,
Yeah.
some store that kept me on hold forever. And I said to my sister, because I had it on speaker, I said, I feel like this is background music to some 80s movie, you know, and like there's a definite like, is there something, Joe, like specific? Because definitely, you know, there's that feel like Denise was talking about of an 80s movie. So it would be like Baby Boom or those kind of movies, you know, like I like do you as a composer, do you know what that is? Like I can't put my finger on it. I just know that sounds like it's something that would be background music for an 80s movie.
It is a
Well,
sound, right? Like you capture, like an era captures a sound, but
But like I
different
can't
sounds for
make it
different
out.
genres. Yeah,
Yeah.
like it is weird.
you know what I find, and because I work in comedy sometimes, I work on another TV show called The Strange Chores. It's the same animation studio as Bluey, but no one watches it. No one's heard of it. I think it's a great show. It's aimed at kids. It's more of a comedy. It's aimed more at older kids, so sort of 6 to 14. Anyway, we are often, it has a lot of references to all the great well, there's, you know, whether they're great or not is subjective, but you know, cult films, let's call them that, of the 80s and 90s. So there's an episode we're doing where their teacher basically turned out to be a robot, but there's just all these Terminator references. You know, it's so many Terminator references. But what I find interesting, because I am a big fan of like B grade 90s, 80s movies, because some of them have brilliant soundtracks, often by a composer called Jerry Goldsmith. And this goes to JD, what you were talking about with synths, I think, or with like music of that period, and how and the music that you listen to on hold. Like I've heard the same thing, and I listen to it and I go, wow, this is so outdated now. But you know, when you would hear this is in a comedy,
Yeah.
because it's funny how something that we took seriously decades ago is now so dated that now it becomes hilarious. So, I mean, it was obviously the same thing. Like whenever you had like a drawbar organ or like a nice string melody with a drawbar organ and like a bongo or something, it was so 60s. It was Wheel of Fortune shopping music, and immediately it's just that, you know, it's instrument. And then now, like a DX7, I use it all the time, with like, you know, really funky synth from the 80s and like a what's that? There's a you hear it a lot even in like Whitney Houston, Stevie Wonder, and it sounds great, but you just go, wow, that sound is so 90s and so 80s, you know, still well done by great musicians. But
Right.
we use it now all the time. So I'll do these big orchestra stuff because a lot of drama and crazy action that happens in it. But we use it for comedic effect to you know, evoke a period. And also we actually do it in the show because the show's kooky and scary in a sort of Tim Burton way, but it is for kids. So we're always talking about, oh, we need to make it, we often just say rubbery. I don't know why we say rubbery. Just need to make it serious and intense, but then just shave off the edge to make it funny. And often it's just like going for those really like dun 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 kind of moments, like
Yeah.
serious, but also just like putting the synths in. Sometimes it can be really serious, and it's like because they're kids who like technology, and they're supposed to be monster hunters in the show, so they've got, and one of them's a bit more of a computer genius, so it's got that kind of vibe to him. But then when you just turn like a sort of the vibrato up or the modulation up on it, and it becomes more wobbly sounding, then it sounds funny, and you just kind of, it loosens everything up, and you mix that with like trumpets or whatever. And anyway, I'm rambling on here, I know, but I find that utterly fascinating because, I mean, if you compare action movies today, Tenet, I mean, it's Hans Zimmer, or I haven't seen Oppenheimer yet, but Inception, perfect example. It's so boomy. I mean, I like Hans Zimmer. I think he's a brilliant producer in particular, and he makes a great soundtrack. And it's fine. But I have a bit of nostalgia for a movie like Executive Decision. I mean, it's very, very patriotic period of the 90s, I think, sort of a Bush era, I guess. But the music in it is stunning. It's got this Jerry Goldsmith stuff with trumpets, and there's all these soaring lines. And it's funny how I find it more emotional and actually a lot less pretentious. And I almost feel like, even though it's a very patriotic film of that time, it almost is just a sense of, it's just, the tongue is very slightly in the cheek, not taking it quite as seriously as you could. Whereas now it's all doom and gloom. I mean, I'm sounding like an old man now, but just, but to do that, to do what Executive Decision did now, we laugh at it a bit. We go, oh, it's so passe. But I also look at it with nostalgia. You know, there's an authenticity and an earnestness that I think we miss today, unfortunately.
Yeah.
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 Absolutely. And I think AI could, as you said, like they could maybe program in to say 80s style, but to get that feeling of whatever that scene might be bringing, how could you have a computer know how to do that? So I think you're right.
And AI will not set the trends. Like AI won't make us go, oh, you don't use that sound anymore. Like that's so dated. Like it'll have no idea, surely. It might pick up on what it can read. I suppose it could in some ways. It's kind of scary when you think about it a bit. But surely it's still humans who drive that change somehow.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not, I hope we're not proven wrong, but I just have this feeling that, like, you know, these are human things that we
Exactly.
hold on to. Yeah.
Yeah. And you know, it's I think, you know, what you bring to that project too, you know, like you were saying that that they came to you with the Dr. Duncan thing, you know, knowing your work, knowing what you've done, what you've achieved, and they've listened. They connected with something, you know, that is what you bring to the table. You know, they connected with Joe Twist. They didn't connect with a piece, you know, that they couldn't place or whatever, you know, like they went to you for a reason. And I just don't see people saying, nah, don't worry about hiring him. We'll run it through AI, you know, like it's strange, you know. I don't know. I hope we're all right in saying that, you know, that it's not a possibility, because who knows what the future holds. But I do think it's really interesting that you know, worked on this watershed project, and it was something that took place like in the 70s, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, in the 70s.
And then, of course, it sort of goes into the 80s in terms of the political machinations. But yeah, like the guts of it happens then, but we sort of reflect on it in the now a bit too. But that's much more kind of, we don't really go there. We just talk about what's happened.
Right. And you know, like when in fact, it was Gemma that told me the premise of the story before, you know, that you just went into a little more detail. She just gave me the high level overview of it, and didn't say anything about the era. And I assumed it was 30, 40, 50, 60s, like, you know, way back, like black and white days, like way back. Like that was just my assumption. I had no idea how recent that was, you know, which is telling, you know, very telling of your, you know, the state of things then, compared to, you know, to us, where it was just all hippies and free love and you know what I mean? That was what made it like super interesting to know that it wasn't that long ago that, you know, the decriminalization of, you know, boy sex was, you know, was squashed. And it's just like, to me, like, I think because we do get taken aback when we hear that, you know, the 80s were 40 years ago, or the 90s were 30 years ago, or whatever. It, you know, it'll always seem like yesterday, you know, those are so impactful. But then I feel like people that were in their 20s and 30s in 2016, when gay marriage became legal in the States or whatever, like, they're going to look back at that time as being like so great, the way we did about the 80s. So it's kind of cool in a way, but it's also like, it snaps you back to reality that we've got such a long way to go as far as, equality and, LGBT things, but, women, trans people, everybody's rights are getting stomped on left and right, no matter what country you're in, there's something going on that is not quite right, and it's just never going to be right with governments getting involved and religion being involved and, laws aimed at certain things that, that the people that are proposing them are not educated enough on them to know that they're not wrong. Sorry. Yeah, not wrong. They want to stop this, they want to put a stop to that, they want to criminalize this, criminalize marijuana, they want to, the women's rights, abortion rights, and all that kind of stuff. Like, get a grip. Like, there's so much worse going on that needs to be
Right. Yeah.
changed
True.
that like it's mind numbing. But what the good thing is that there'll always be music. They're never going to outlaw that. The same
No, that's,
thing,
yeah, I hope not. That sounds very Spanish Inquisition. That's like, going right back, banning music, I mean, how the money they would lose banning music, hopefully it would, that wouldn't happen.
But it's all crazy interesting. And I actually couldn't wait to have this conversation, because I know that it would go in all kinds of places, and it would be everybody would take away something from it and learn something from it. So I just appreciate your time and allowing us to creep into your evening like this.
No, it's a pleasure. I'm always up for chats about stuff. It helps me learn and kind of from different perspectives as well.
Right.
I love that. That's why I collaborate with people. I always learn more from other people. And also just it helps me kind of crystallize what it is that I do, because sometimes you can you focus on in the weeds on certain things and you kind of don't have time to step back and look at what it is you do. But it's been a pleasure. If you're
my hope is that it'll turn people on.
Sorry, what's that?
That's my hope, is that it'll turn people on to paying attention to
Yes.
background music and cinematic scores, and the music that you hear in plays, and go check out an opera, go see, this is the BBC Proms is winding up, so I'm looking forward to the last night of Proms, like how fun that was. Like, that was a whole new experience for me, to see how involved British culture is in that kind of classical symphonic type music, that they do it for like an entire month, and then everybody's all into it, and then at the end it's like one giant party. Like, it's unbelievable. They're bringing their things and waving their flags and wearing their funny hats and sunglasses, and it's like I was honestly, I was so impressed with how cool this was, that every year now, like, I'm into it. So that's what I mean. I think hopefully we can open some minds and make people appreciate and pay attention more to things they take for granted, or don't even, that just slip by. It's great.
It always surprises me when I see a movie with other people who are not like musically too much inclined, even if they're not musicians, but if they're just not really paying, some people don't pay that much attention. So I'll leave a movie or walk out of a play thinking, my God, that music, the background music was so amazing. And they'll be like, I guess, like they didn't really pay attention.
Yeah, they just came away from it, not even remembering, right?
I hope, like what you said, people start paying more attention to that, because that's such a part.
Yeah.
It can be funny too, because movies are so diverse. I mean, there are movies that don't need music almost at all, and they're better off without it. So it's funny. I mean, and so if you really want to be existential about it, you can question, when music stops and noise begins, and what is music anyway. But let's not go there. Let's go. But you can almost get into this, because some of even doing what we do is actually deciding, no, this is better with no music. This is much like, and I've had often, I'll have disagreements saying, I don't think there should be music here personally, or I'll say, no, there should be music here, with directors and what have you, and film in particular. I mean, opera, it's like I said, it's the music that actually drives the story. It's it's the film that rolls along. So you sort of, and then the action and the drama is shaped on that. We had a dancer in the show as well. By the way, I should say, you can actually hear Watershed. It's online. If you just Google Watershed in full, for some reason in full, yeah, it'll come up. It's on ABC Classic, and the performance is there. Just the audio, but it's great recording. I need to get it released properly somehow, but I think they want to wait for the Opera House version. So, but yeah, if people want to hear it, it's all there. And even just to pick on one up quickly on one little thing you mentioned about, you know, the period, the 70s and the 80s, and how instruments play into that. I played a delicate balance with one particular part of Watershed where Don Dunstan has this solos, aria type thing. Don Dunstan really being kind of political hero in the whole thing. But it was his struggle. He was arguing with the police, and he was putting on record what he believed that had happened that night, and the police were involved and what have you. It's a short little thing, but I actually put a guitar in there with a effects pedal that sounded very 80s porn. Like, but I did it in just the right way. I mean, the music was very, in some ways the music was almost a bit filmic, but it was very struggle hero kind of thing. Like, it was exploring different chords, and then would reach a sort of moment and come back down, and then it would reflect the words of what he was saying. You know, I believe this and I believe that. And he's telling this whole thing. I believe in 1972 there was a police cover up, running of Duncan, they're the words. And it's rhythm, and then there's this guitar, like kind of, you know, going along there. But it was just kind of cool. I thought that this is it. It's because he was a really cool guy. He was a groovy left-wing politician of the time who, you know, people believed in at the time, because it was sort of the period of free love and hippies. Like, there's a bit of that involved, what have you. And for, you know, for queer rights, it was very early for Australia. And it was a watershed moment. So it's funny how that's just another example of how you can rationalize, I suppose, after the fact, but you can try something that you might think, oh, is this going to work? And even though you'd think, oh, that's a terrible idea because that's so dated and it's like so, you know, bad taste, it worked. It just kind of gave him a touch of pizzazz or something, whatever that is, you know.
Right.
But the music was still serious. The strings are playing serious chords and rhythms and harmonies, but this guitar is just like jamming out. So,
without being bow chicka bow bow.
yeah, without being totally, you know. Although we are talking about sex after all, but
yeah, exactly.
You know, the whole thing. But it's still it almost was like a moment of lightness, because then there's a court case and it's really intense and dramatic and what have you. So I'm always, it's all just part of the fun of storytelling, you know. So every song does it, and in some ways an opera or a oratorio or a film's a little different, but they're still just telling a story the same way a song does, just in a different way. It's just unfolding over time and words, and married with music that makes you feel a certain way, you know. It just
yeah, well,
I love it.
Got quite the talent for it. So you keep doing what you do, and we'll just have to keep an eye on you, mister.
Oh yeah,
thank you.
Pleasure meeting you, Joe.
Likewise, Jay. Yes.
Yeah,
today.
Like I said, I've heard so much about you. I couldn't wait for this. Like, Gemma speaks so highly of you, and she's always keeping up with whatever you've got going on and filling me in. And so I this has been an absolute pleasure, like, to say now that we have met. So next time you're in London, she said that we're all getting together.
I appreciate it. And thank you for being so accommodating.
No worries.
My night owl tendencies. It actually works great, I'm sure, with time differences, and after all. So
it was a lot of time zone math. Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, we're getting better and better at it. All right, my friend, it was a pleasure, and we'll keep.
Mine.
Yeah, we'll keep up, and we'll hope everybody opens their minds a little bit.
Great.
Take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Why do you always run back to
Like, never stop chasing your dreams.
the lover you
There, that's see?
We drank way too much whiskey.
And I confess, my My addiction is you. Don't ask me why I'm here tonight. I had to take this midnight drive to find you. And as I come in through the door, I see her dancing on the floor beside you. Why do you always run back to the lover you once knew? You're addicted to her touch, that's true. And I confess, my addiction is you. You look at me and in my eyes you see the hurt I can't disguise. I watch you, and though it seems I look right through, I'm noticing your every move. She's got you. Why do you always run back to the lover you once knew? You're addicted to her touch, that's true. And I confess, my addiction is you. Why do you always run back to the lover you once knew? You're addicted to her touch, that's true. And I confess, my addiction is you. I turn away to mask the pain, but jealousy reveals my rage and madness. And knowing you can read my mind consumes me in a shameful kind of sadness. Why do you always run back to the lover you once knew? You're addicted to her touch, that's true. And I confess, my addiction is you. You are my drug, my ever-waking need. I got you in my blood. You've got me on my knees. Why do you always run back to the lover you once knew? You're addicted to her touch, that's true. And I confess, my addiction is you. Why do you run? Why do you My addiction. Why do you run? My addiction. Why do you run? My addiction.